Hello everyone and welcome to a new video of your Polyglot Academy. Today it's lesson 16 and we're going to talk about the irregular verbs. So let's start. Now here you can see from this table three examples of three irregular verbs. Sprechen, which means to speak, fahren, which means to drive, and nehmen, which means to take. Now let's have a look at this table and try to find out what is kind of special from the conjugation of these verbs, or what is something that changes in comparison to the other persons. Now, if you observe long enough, you can see that the second singular person and the third singular person kind of have a change in the vowel of the root of the word. So, for example, if we have a look at sprechen, we can see that we have ich spreche, wir sprechen, ihr sprecht, sie sprechen. So we have a ni as a vowel in the root. But then for the second and the third singular person, we have du sprichst and spricht. So we have an I all of a sudden. So that is a very important thing to notice. But other than that, another very important thing to notice is that even though we saw that the vowel is changing, the root vowel is changing in the second and third personal singular, the ending of these verbs, the ending of the conjugations is still remaining the same for all persons. So we already discussed this in lesson 4 while talking about the present simple, but we can see how the endings e, est, t, and tn are basically staying, even though we're talking about irregular verbs. So now we can simply define two main rules in order to define irregular verbs in order to talk about them. Now, irregular verbs modify their thematic vowel, so in other words, the vowel that characterizes the root theme, by alternating it with another vowel in the second and third personal singular. So that is basically what I said earlier. And the second rule is that the endings, however, are the same as those we have already learned in lesson 4. So the endings of irregular verbs are the same ones as if for regular verbs. So this is very peculiar and very important to note, so that it's going to be easier to remember these verbs. Now, the main question of this video is how to form irregular verbs. And in German, there are mostly 4 cases. So here you can see 4 changes, 4 possible cases, and it's mainly highlighting the 4 opportunities we have while altering the vowel in the root theme. So we might have a possibility where we have an E in the vowel and then we are having an I, or we have simply an A and then all of a sudden or we have an E and then all of a sudden IE, so E and then I, or we might have an A and a U and then all of a sudden and then a U. Here you can see some examples. Now we already tackled the verb sprechen in the first example, but here you can see some other examples of verbs which have an I in the root. So for example, we have geben, nehmen, helfen, essen, brechen, and treffen. And here you can also see the translations of these verbs. And you can see how you can see the corrected version of these verbs for the second and the third person singular. So for example, ich gebe, wir geben, ihr gebt, and sie geben would be, for example, the regular conjugation for geben. But for the second and the third person singular, we have du gibst and gibt. So all of a sudden, we have a change in the vowel. The second case would be a change from a to a ä. And this is most important for verbs like fahren, waschen, schlafen lassen, laden, fallen, and tragen. And in the third column, you can see how this change is affecting the verb. So for example, ich fahre, and then you would have it for the second and the third person singular, du fährst, fährt. So we do not only have a change in the vowel, but also in the pronunciation of the verb. So this is also very important to notice. Thirdly, we're gonna have a change between and then ie. So for example, for the verbs sehen, lesen, and stehlen, we're going to have for the second and third singular person du stiehlst, du siehst, and sieht. Or for example, for lesen, du liest, liest. And last example is that we're going to have a change from au to oi. So for example, laufen becomes du läufst and er läuft. Now, we discussed irregular verbs, but in German there are also some other verbs with small irregularities that also need to be spoken about. So we also need to speak about these verbs. Now, here are two examples of these verbs, and we're basically talking about verbs whose stem ends in T and D and add an E between the stem and the ending. So for example, arbeiten, its stem is ending in T, or finden, whose stem is ending in D, and we are basically adding an E between the stem and the ending. So for example, du arbeitest is going to be the right way to say the second person singular because we're adding an E between the part of Arbeit and st, which is the ending. So that is also very important to know. And another small irregularity, which is basically the same one, also applies to verbs whose stem ends in M and N. And those kind of verbs also add an E between the stem and the ending. So for example, for verbs such as öffnen and atmen, which means to open and to breathe, you also add this E between the stem and the ending of the conjugation. Now, the last small irregularity that needs to be known is that in verbs whose root ends in scharfes S, double S, C, or tz, the second person singular behaves like the third singular. And this is very important to know in order to not make any dumb mistake in German. So for example, if you observe the conjugation of the verb heißen, you can see that the second and the third person singular are the same, and that is very important to know because du heißt would be very difficult to pronounce if you wouldn't define these rule for such verbs. So that's also important to know in order to not make any mistakes. And we are going to end this lesson with some exercises. Please try to complete the following sentences by entering the correct irregular verbs. And please leave a comment below so that I can respond to your solution of the exercises and so that I can correct them. I will give you a direct feedback to that. And other than that, thanks for listening if you went so far, and have a nice day.